The only threat to Australia bares its teeth again. Coming up on this week's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 27th of November 2025. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party leader Robert Barwick.
Thanks, Elisa. And also on the show today, we're going to talk about why the IMF is unhappy at the Citizens Party for stopping its bankers' dictatorship, calls for the bank regulator to rein in lending to housing investors, Bendigo Bank caught in a money laundering scandal, inflation is rising, so the Reserve Bank and APRA must act, and law and order breaks down in Victoria.
So, bit of news today. Now, please help us get the show circulating by hitting the like button or making a comment below. If you're not a subscriber, you can subscribe and ring the notification bell for updates of new shows coming out, new updates. And please consider making a donation and joining us as a member. We'll say more about that as the show goes on and how you can get engaged in the process of changing politics in this country, which is rather urgent.
Exactly.
And our updates really make that point clear. First of all, in reference to one of our most successful campaigns, in the last week or so, the International Monetary Fund issued its staff concluding statement of the 2025 Article 4 mission. So this was in reference to the huge fight that we led last year to stop Treasurer Jim Chalmers giving away the power that our government has over the RBA, an oversight power, the power to direct it if necessary, which, by the way, has never actually been used, but it's
which
there.
The IMF noted.
Yes, which the IMF noted. This is what the IMF said. It was only a brief reference, but they were talking about the push to bolster the RBA's transparency and independence as outlined in the RBA review, which they said was welcome, including the establishment of the separate monetary policy board. And they noted that the Treasury Secretary still has a role on the board, but is confined to act in an individual capacity. They're trying to get anyone in government or close to government out of the RBA altogether, if they had their way. Then they said this: while it has never been invoked, repealing the Treasurer's power to override monetary policy decisions, as also recommended by the RBA review, would further strengthen central bank independence.
So, Elisa, that's a year, as you said, after we actually stopped Jim Chalmers from doing exactly that. And that is one of our most spectacular victories in a way, because it just sort of came together quite well. What had happened was Jim Chalmers got elected as Treasurer in 2022. He initiates this RBA review, gets three wonks to get together and say, how can we improve the Reserve Bank of Australia? They came up with, I believe there were 50 recommendations. And number one got your attention, because you're actually one of Australia's leading experts on this. It got the attention of a staffer in the Greens party who we'd been working with on this very subject, right? Number one of 50 recommendations. So the priority recommendation was to remove a power that had never been used in 70 years, actually 80 years now. In 80 years, this power has never been used, and they wanted to remove it. And we uniquely, because we had briefed the Greens and other parties like One Nation, etc., we uniquely knew the origin of this power. And it comes down to this, to who's in charge, the elected government or the bankers. And if it's not the elected government and it's the bankers, and they aren't democratically accountable, what you have is a banker's dictatorship. The origin of this was in the Great Depression, 1930. We had a government, Labor government. We had 33% male unemployment, starvation in Australia, families being crushed. The government owned its own bank called the Commonwealth Bank. And the government said to the bank that it owned, issue 18 million pounds, 6 million for investment in agriculture, 12 million for investment in infrastructure projects to create jobs to alleviate the suffering of the Depression. The governor of the Commonwealth Bank said to the people who owned his bank, I bloody well won't. So Robert Gibson. And what he was actually doing was aligning with the Bank of England, because the Bank of England had ordered Australia tighten its belt, cut everyone's salaries by 20% or something ridiculous, right? Mass austerity, and this governor of the Commonwealth Bank thought in realms of economics he was a higher power than the elected government. Now, that led to a split in the Labor Party. Labor lost office. They didn't come back to office till World War II, but while they were out of office, there was a Royal Commission that the Conservative government actually felt it had to call. And the Royal Commission looked into this subject and said, well, hang on, in the financial system, Parliament must be the ultimate authority. And the government of the day is the executive of Parliament. That was the conclusion, right? So it laid down a principle that if we're going to pretend we're a democracy, Parliament must be in charge. That government, the Menzies government, didn't implement that recommendation, but when John Curtin and Ben Chifley took office again, they implemented it in the 1945 Commonwealth Bank Act. Robert Menzies kept it in the 1959 Reserve Bank Act. Only a few treasurers had ever threatened to use it. It had never been used, but it was always there as this little fail-safe democratic control measure, that if you had a situation like the 1930s again, and a bastard in charge of the bank who didn't care how many people were starving in the country, the elected government whose job it is to care could step in and say, no, you're not going to do that, right? We're going to override you. So we explain this to people. We launched a massive mobilisation. We flooded Parliament with calls in 2023 and 2024. One of the officers of Parliament said there's no one like the Citizens Party to melt the phones down. Forced it to an inquiry. When the inquiry was held, out of the woodwork comes former treasurers, including Paul Keating and Peter Costello, who actually testified at the hearing, former Reserve Bank governors, and all these people who had actually had experience in the relationship between Treasurer and the Reserve Bank said, it's mad to get rid of this law. Yep. Keep it. You must keep it. And that was enough to shift the Liberal Party. And so a year ago, on the last day of Parliament, Jim Chalmers wanted to get his bill through that was going to implement the other 49 recommendations or so, 48 recommendations. And the only way he could do it was agreeing to drop this. So that was a victory. We celebrated a year ago, an incredible victory. But the IMF is, what this thing shows, the IMF still isn't happy. And
the rest of the report is basically that same dictation of austerity and cutting budgets that we did back in the 1930s at the behest of the Bank of England.
They're not happy that when they give orders to Australia through the Reserve Bank, whatever, they know that there's a democratic mechanism that could override them.
Yes. Now, speaking of the powers that the RBA has, some of which have been passed on to APRA in regard to regulating bank lending, you've written about the massive explosion of bank lending to housing investors this week.
Look, and let me state from the outset, I'm going to say, so I'm hoping people are paying attention. What I'm about to talk about is why house prices are high, not immigration. Immigration is a band-aid that some governments have resorted to cover the wound they created by this. This is the cause. Understand the difference. So yes, you can have a crazy government that says, oh, we're going to bring in 1 million people in a year, right? Because we want to keep propping up house prices. But they're trying to prop up a problem that was created by something else. And even then, what migrants buy is still not the main driver. This is it. And the main driver from the beginning, the thing that took Australian house prices, Elisa, from its historical ratio of 3 to 4 times income, which had been the ratio for a century, and turned it into 10 to 15 times income, which is what's crushing us today, is in 1999, Peter Costello and John Howard created a tax cut for investors that incentivised a flood of investors into the market. And by 2004, they were given a warning by the Productivity Commission, said your incentive for investors has made housing unaffordable. And they didn't do anything. So I know that, we've talked about this before, so what's quite interesting now is a couple of economists, one is Saul Eslake, former ANZ bank economist, the other one is Barbara Pocock from the Greens, in the same week have both come out saying, look what's happened to investor lending in Australia. The government, the regulator needs to do something. What's happened is, on the back of the, first the interest rate cuts, and then Anthony Albanese's 5% deposit scheme for all first home buyers, the way the investors think, most of the investors are not, they're speculators. So as soon as interest rates went down, they thought, house prices are going to go up. And then when the 5% deposit thing was announced, they're going to go up more. So what they do is they run to the bank. I think the bank meets them halfway, to be honest, because the bank's in on this as well. They go, here's a chance, pile in. And so the bank will write a loan to an investor in a heartbeat. Your kid, your 30-year-old kid who you want out of your house, who's got a $100,000 a year job, will never get a loan from the bank under these circumstances, right? But then the bank will say to them, hey, do you want to be an investor too? So they'll write these loans to investors, and suddenly the lending to investors starts going up. And what had happened was, you can see that we'll put the graph up there. Since 2020, investor lending had gone right down because APRA had put a brake on it in 2015. It had gone right down. Since 2020, it's gone up, and this year it's spiked up at a very fast rate. The growth in investor lending is over 10% a year. And so these economists are saying, hang on, put the brakes on like APRA effectively did in 2015. Because otherwise you're just going to, this becomes a self-feeding thing, right? These investors get into the market and make everything completely unaffordable. And the government knew this. That if Anthony Albanese didn't know this, he's the only Prime Minister with an economics degree we've had, by the way. If he didn't know this when he announced his 5% deposit scheme, then he's too dumb to be Prime Minister, right? The fact that he did know it, so they call it, we're going to make housing affordable for you, knowing they're going to make it unaffordable. And APRA has the power, as does the Reserve Bank. One of them needs to use this power. Stop the lending to investors.
Yes, well, on that topic or related, it has been announced this week that inflation has jumped up significantly. And so this is where we do need the RBA and APRA to act in these capacities. We're using the powers the IMF would like us to get rid of and related powers, where, for instance, the Reserve Bank had the power to direct the kind of lending banks could do that was handed to APRA, but we don't use this.
Well, technically shared with APRA because they didn't repeal it. So the Reserve Bank could still do it. But yeah, they have the power to do this. And so we just talked about investor lending going up. And in the next breath, we're talking about inflation going up. The two are related. Half of the component of the CPI, that's inflation, is housing costs. So they've made housing more expensive and suddenly inflation's going up. Now, the other part is energy because the rebates came off, etc. So, APRA, Reserve Bank, act. The big lie, Elisa, from the Reserve Bank always is we only have one tool, interest rates. No, they've got this tool where they can direct the banks and say, they don't tell the banks who to loan to. They can't do that. But they can say, these are the types of loans that you can make. Stop lending to investors, start lending to first home buyers, start lending to small business, start lending to small industry firms that you never want to lend to, right? The ones who actually employ people, start lending to them, stop lending to investors that are just parasites that are trying to make everything more expensive.
All right, Bendigo Bank, latest scandal.
Well, it couldn't happen to a nicer bank, as we know. We've been banging on about Bendigo Bank since July here because Bendigo Bank decided it's going to become one of the big banks now. Well, it's now in a big bank scandal. Its big brothers, Commonwealth Bank and Westpac, when they fell into the same scandal, Commonwealth Bank got a $700 million fine. Westpac got a $1.3 billion fine, and this is for not having proper systems for money laundering, right? Now, the money laundering regime, Elisa, is pretty basic. There's a regulator called AUSTRAC. It's actually a law enforcer called AUSTRAC. It polices money laundering, and it has one requirement of the financial system: declare any transactions over $10,000. And all they're trying to do is say, you declare it, we will spot the patterns. They're not asking for more than that. Now, banks have used that to then go get really in your face when you go to the bank and try and pull out cash, right? And people have all experienced this. That is them just covering their asses, right? They have no right to do that, but what are you going to do? You're their customer, you're captive to them. They think, well, you're not going to bother leaving so they can give you a hard time. But actually what the regulator requires is just that declaration. And it turns out these banks aren't even very good at doing that, right? So Bendigo is the latest one that's been caught out. And as Dale Webster pointed out to me, one of the things that Bendigo might be creating rod for its own back here, because by closing branches in regional areas, what you do is you force people to have to go further to visit a bank. And when they do, they think, well, I can't do it every day, or I can't do it every week, so I'll do it once a month. So when they go to the bank, they still need the same amount of cash they would normally need, right? So they get more of it out. And then often, because in country areas, they're often going above the $10,000 threshold, right? Because they need the cash. Australia, especially regional Australia, cannot operate without cash. And so did that contribute to this? We don't know. But certainly Bendigo Bank is in trouble and its share price tanked yesterday.
Right, now the last update, law and order breaks down in Victoria.
All right, this is quite important. This is a little teaser for something that I'm going to cover next week with Richard Barden. But I want to talk about people, I'm sure everyone in Australia is familiar with the law and order problem here. And it clearly is a problem. And we know part of the problem is the leniency of the courts on these repeated offenders. Everybody's heard of the leniency of the courts. And so law and order is out of control here. I just want to focus on one particular offender. Now, this is a guy who has been convicted twice of assault, avoided jail both times, has been charged with assault again, was on remand for a little while, but then let out by the court as well on that. And so he's still facing the third charge of assault, and now he's out. I mean, that's how weak the courts are in Australia. But I want to play you a clip of the first assault that he committed. Now, and this is courtesy of Channel 9. You don't often get this kind of crime caught so well on camera. Just look at the nature of this particular assault.
But when Thomas Sewell didn't get what he wanted, he and his cameraman took it out on an innocent man.
Dance, monkey, dance.
Watch yourself, bro. I'm not a dance monkey. Watch your clock.
You touch me.
Repeatedly punching a security guard in the head, Sewell tackled and dragged him to the ground after the father escorted the neo-Nazi from the Channel 9 building last year.
You can't put your hands on people.
A magistrate described the attack as unjustified violence that should never be tolerated in society, then let the 29-year-old walk with no jail time.
Now, Elisa, what you've seen there is, now that is a real assault. That's someone laying into someone else all on camera. When that went to court and he was found guilty, well, how could you not be found guilty? The judge let him off without jail time because he said, I've got a baby about to be born. Oh, okay, yeah, fine. No worries, mate. I don't know if people recognise that person. That is Thomas Sewell of the National Socialist Network. Now, he's been making a lot of headlines lately, and I'm asking questions about why this guy gets so many bloody headlines. Anything he does is wall-to-wall news. We've had Nazis, these people are Hitler-loving Nazis, total white supremacist racists. They've always existed in Australia since before World War II. And for decades and decades and decades, they've just been ignored. There've been this tiny fringe over there. Now they get wall-to-wall coverage. But I'm asking, why is this guy who gets to command all this coverage getting away with that was an assault on a security officer, security guard at Channel 9. That's why it's on camera so well. This guy was ushering them out of the building. He was a black man, an African-American black man, and he and his thug buddy, Thomas Sewell, just laid into him and just bang, bang, bang. And of course he was convicted of that. But why no jail time? Then he gets convicted again. He assaults people up in the Grampian Mountains or something. He gets convicted of that again. No jail time. Now, the third assault, people have probably heard it more recently at the what they call Camp Sovereignty, near the War Memorial Shrine there. After a rally, one of his March for Australia, kick out all the non-white people out of Australia rallies. He's on camera assaulting again, right? And he was initially denied bail because some judge finally did their job and now some other person's over, oh no, let him out. And so he gets to go out and he's this, sort of like martyr type figure leading this. So we're going to talk about this more next week. And this is a bit of a teaser, but we're raising this because there's something strange about the way this particular group of Nazis is being so widely promoted in Australia right now. And it's feeding into, let's put it this way, it's starting to look very convenient for the establishment. And there's actually a history of the relationship between the establishment and the extremist groups all around the world to achieve certain outcomes. So we'll talk about that more next week with
Yes.
Richard.
Now, there is an article in this week's Australian Alert on that subject, and also it contains all more background information on all the topics we discussed. So here are the details.
The narrow agendas of mainstream media outlets are not telling you the full story. The weekly Citizens Party Australian Alert provides in-depth insights into issues that matter to all Australians. The Australian Alert holds a mirror to those in the halls of power, reporting on issues of national importance that are being buried by the major parties. It's reported on the misconduct of banks and major corporates, the persecution of those doing their jobs, and the failure of regulators to do theirs. Economic coverage puts real issues on the political agenda. There's serious analysis of global issues, the Washington Insiders report, and the global threat from endless wars. Everything you should know every week is in the Australian Alert. Subscribe today for hard copy and digital versions.
Welcome back. The only threat to Australia bares its teeth again. Who's the only threat to Australia? Well, clue, we are going to discuss here the eruption of tensions between Japan and China, which were triggered by the statements of the Japanese Prime Minister, Takaichi, where she has announced...
Well, she was asked a question in Parliament. She responded in this way.
If a military attack were launched against Taiwan and a naval blockade were carried out using warships, together with other methods, then the use of force could occur.
Her announcement reveals more to those who understand Japan, its constitution, and the various tensions regarding Taiwan. So she said that any Chinese military action to retain Taiwan as part of China would constitute a, quote, survival threatening situation. But what does that mean? What does that phrase mean?
So this is a specific formulation in Japanese law that was passed 10 years ago, and we'll talk about more of that in a minute, that for the first time overturned the whole basis of Japan's pacifism since World War II, and said Japan will be justified in getting involved in foreign conflicts on behalf of allies if whatever's happening, even if Japan itself is not being attacked, if whatever's happening there constitutes a survival threatening situation to Japan. That's what the words are in the law. And it's not just in Japanese law, Elisa, it's in Japan's treaty with the United States. So it's actually something that if this is triggered, it means it would be Japan and the United States legally, a legal basis for Japan and the United States getting involved in a war.
So we'll go into some of the background of that so that people can understand the full import of why this is such a big deal. But we'll also draw out the fact that while China is reacting, justifiably so, Australia is not.
You know, we haven't proved that China's reaction is justified. We're about to. But as we do, ask yourself, why isn't Australia? Because as the headline of this segment is, the only threat to Australia. There's only one country that's ever threatened us, actually attacked us. Only one. It wasn't China, it was Japan. And I personally, I often tell the story. I'm in politics because I got interested in this kind of stuff early when I was a teenager. So I sort of naturally got involved. I remember feeling with relief when I learned as a teenager, reading some of the stuff I read, that Japan had a pacifist constitution. Because my grandfather fought against them in World War II. I knew some of the history of Japan's atrocities. Certainly my mother hated the Japanese and for what they did in the war. And so it was a real, here's a teenager, me, feeling immensely relieved that, a country like Japan that was so threatening now has completely renounced war. It's a pacifist country. But 10 years ago, that changed, right? And we have to look at why and what that means.
All right, now let's look at China's red lines and China's reaction, because on the 21st of November, China's ambassador to the United Nations wrote a letter to the United Nations, and they said, look, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they made clear that this is seen by them as a preparation for an armed intervention, as they put it, in the cross-strait situation, and they would consider it a quote, act of aggression, in which they would exercise their right to self-defence and under the UN Charter and to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. The same day, the Chinese embassy in Japan posted a warning saying that the Charter of the United Nations includes the enemy state clauses, which stipulate that if any of the fascist or militarist states from World War II, Germany, Italy and Japan, take any step to re-implement an aggressive policy, the founding member states of the UN shall be entitled to take direct military action against it without the authorization of the UN Security Council. So this is international law.
That's quite a clause there, actually. I only learned about that this week once the Chinese raised it. But yeah, because Japan and Germany were the aggressors, when the UN was agreed to, the clause is in there. If one of those countries steps out of line again, any country who's a member of the UN can whack them, right? And it's completely legal under international law. And China's saying, hello, if you're going to threaten us over Taiwan, which is our business, not yours, and this is why, see, Taiwan is the ultimate red line for China. It told the whole world from the beginning. And 50 years ago, when China started to open up relations with other countries, including Australia, had one condition: agree there's one China. Taiwan is part of one China. And we all agreed. We all happily agreed. And 50 years later, our sides are trying to overturn that. They're trying to water that down. They're trying to get in. They're trying to use Taiwan as something to provoke China with, because there are people in America and Britain and other places and idiots in Australia who actually want a conflict, right? And so Taiwan's a way to do that. But when it comes to Japan, China is the most sensitive.
Yes.
Because it was Japan. Japan did two things in this front. First of all, Japan got into a war with China in 1895 and took Taiwan off it and occupied Taiwan for 50 years, quite brutally. But to this day, there's a lot of Japanese hangover in Taiwan. There's people who are, got Japanese ancestry and all sorts of stuff. That is a hangover from that Japanese occupation. When Japan was defeated in World War II, Taiwan was returned to China, right? So that's a very big deal to China. Second is Japan was in 1931. World War II started for China that year, not in 1939, 1931, because that's when Japan invaded Manchuria first and occupied a big chunk of China, and they used as an excuse self-defense. Japan said, we're doing this in our self-defense. So they've used this formulation before, right? Now, at that time, Elisa, China was very weak. It was a very weak, yes, still the biggest country in the world, but very weak. And China's saying to Japan now, hey, buddy, we're not very weak anymore. We're the strongest country in the world. You're not going to get away with this. And so then the question is, who was stupid enough in Japan to be put up to this?
And, we've just come back from China. China, guards this history very, very preciously, because it never wants to see, as you see also with Russia, I mean, the numbers of war dead. The weight,
35 million killed and wounded in China.
Yes, the weight of that. I mean, the number of memorials and history museums, you don't see anything like it here, for instance.
We attended the Nanjing Massacre Memorial.
Yes.
Up to 300,000 Chinese killed by Japan in 6 weeks in one city.
So, they're not going to let this happen again. No. Don't be fooled. But after World War II, let's talk about what happened to the Japanese constitution. What was enshrined there.
So I want to read the famous Article 9 of Japan's constitution, right? Because it's crystal clear. There's no ambiguity in this article. It's extraordinary that what's happening now can even happen given its constitution. So Article 9 states, it's titled Renunciation of War. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. the right of belligerency of the state will not be recognised. They were giving up their rights to wage any kind of war, right? That's what that constitution says. So how is it now that Japanese soldiers are training with Australia up in Northern Territory in our war game things up that we do up there? This year, the Japanese forces were there. How has that come about?
Now, so what changed? This is what they're doing is unconstitutional. What changed to make this acceptable inside Japan?
Well, bear in mind, it's not considered legally in Japanese system. It's not considered unconstitutional. Whatever their top court hasn't ruled it so. It should be, but they've come up with workarounds.
Okay.
The fact that they have but the fact that they have been able to do it tells you something. One of the things that has defined Japan since World War II, Elisa, is whatever America says goes, essentially. That's not 100% absolute, but pretty much close, right? Japan, America reconstructed Japan, right? And so the fact that this is now, and I'll go through the details, but the fact this is now constitutional tells me America wanted it so. Because when it happened, America had started changing what Japan has done is conveniently in line with America's policy of targeting China. And I'll give you a date first, 2011. 2011, Barack Obama visited Australia. A very breathless Julia Gillard made an announcement with him. He announced what was called the Asia Pivot. Paraphrase the Asia Pivot. We've spent 10 years screwing up the Middle East, getting nowhere. We're going to pivot all of our military to Asia. That's what he announced in 2011. We're going to get up in China's face now. Julia Gillard allowed him to station Marines in Darwin, right? The tip of the spear, the Marines are called. That gave them proximity to help shut off the Malacca Strait, which is where China's oil supply came from. It's a way to choke China. That triggered what is now being screamed about as China's military buildup. It was only after that China started reclaiming the islands and militarising them in the South China Sea, after we did something that no Australian Prime Minister had allowed Americans to do since World War II. No Australian Prime Minister had allowed a permanent American military presence here. Julia Gillard did that. That upset the balance. And then China had to respond. It started militarising, building up its military, etc. That's even before Xi Jinping got sworn in. He wasn't president yet. Everything gets blamed on Xi. No, this is China as China saying, whoa, you're not going to upset the balance here. So in 2015, clearly with American support, Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister at the time, a good mate of Tony Abbott's, by the way, and that's relevant when you consider what he believes in, he rammed through this special security legislation that allowed the Japan Self-Defense Force, JSDF, because Japan was allowed to have a few coast guards or whatever, to fight in other countries even when Japan wasn't attacked under a survival threatening situation. Like I said, it also triggers the US alliance, the US treaty, right? This at the time was extremely controversial in Japan, like extremely controversial, massive protests, etc. And that again tells me that it only got through because the Americans wanted it. Like the whole country was in uproar. There's a strong current of pacifism and peace in Japan, a very, very strong one. Not all the Japanese people are like this, right? This is what has happened in Japan, though. There's been this right-wing reactionary revisionist current that not only wants to remilitarize, they deny what they did in World War II. They think they were fine in World War II. And so when you hear that it was such a stink in 2015, that Japan was torn apart about this, you ask the question, well, do I remember it being that controversial at the time? Why wasn't it controversial here?
Yeah.
There was the one other country in the world that was controversial was China. China saw what they were doing, right? It was very, very upset, but why weren't we? We were also a victim of Japan. Now, at the time, Abe was very careful when he pushed through this law, very careful not to say the name China, right? But as soon as he left office, then it was the mask was off. Yeah, of course it's about China. He actually said in 2021, December 2021, during an online appearance at a Taiwan think tank event, Abe stated, quote, "A Taiwan contingency is a contingency for Japan. It's exactly what this Takeichi is his protege, right? So exactly what she said. He goes, in other words, this is Abe back again, it is also a contingency for the Japan-US alliance. And that's pretty open about, and so the Chinese know, okay, if you're China, you're not actually afraid of Japan. You could wipe Japan off the map. And the UN charter says you can, right? But they know that behind Japan is America using Japan as its proxy.
Yes. Now, Pete Hegseth, the US... Hegseth.
That sounds like a better way to pronounce his name. Hegseth. It sort of fits with his whatever. Anyway, it sounds good. Hegseth.
The US Secretary of War, not Defence, earlier this year announced that America was beefing up its presence in Japan, and he demanded from Japan and Australia that we say openly what we would provide to the US in regard to any conflict or any move by China to retake Taiwan by force.
If America had to fight China over Taiwan, he wanted us to say what we would do, right?
And the Japanese Prime Minister declined to answer at that time, but of course now we've got a new Prime Minister.
Well, that's the thing. The previous Prime Minister was unprovocative. He wasn't going to let this idiot. I mean, Pete Hegseth, let's face it, he's an idiot. Like, it's scary this guy is the Secretary of Defense in America, right? He's a thug. He's a virtual reality star, whatever you call it, television reality star, right? Reality TV star kind of vibe. This guy, full of tats about the crusade and whatever. And so the Japanese Prime Minister said, no, we're not going to talk about that. Australia didn't get drawn into it either, by the way. But then suddenly he's replaced. This woman comes in, she's a wannabe Margaret Thatcher, and she gives him exactly what she wants. Yes, we will engage because we'll consider it a survival threatening situation.
Now, we're going to talk about Australia's reaction, but first we're going to take a quick break and tell you how you can get more involved.
You deserve a future where the people, not entrenched power, determines Australia's direction. That's why you should join the Citizens Party. You need post offices and regional bank branches to remain open. A government that invests in people, not submarines that will never arrive. And a foreign policy that's in our national interest. We've stopped the cash ban legislation and led the fight to hold major banks to account. Tens of thousands of Australians have signed our petitions, and it's made a real difference. It's time for action as we push towards our goal of 10,000 members. Join the Citizens Party at citizensparty.org.au and be part of the movement that's shaping Australia's future.
Welcome back. Now, before we get to the Australian reaction, to fill out this picture and provide a real living colour, a real sense of what is at stake here, I wanted to report on something. Again, it's covered in the Australian Alert, an article I wrote, which reports on an article that's just been published by the New York Council on Foreign Relations, sister organisation of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. These are the Anglo-American meddlers extraordinaire that are always pushing for war. And their article in Foreign Affairs, put it up on the screen, their journal this week, calls for reinventing the post-World War II order. I mean, they say they're reinforcing it, but that is rewriting history for sure. By arming the main aggressor nations of World War II with nuclear weapons. So they are suggesting that the United States should encourage a, quote, small set of allies, namely Canada, Germany and Japan, to go nuclear. And they claim that this selective proliferation would help uphold the post-World War II order. That's a direct quote. They say were Canada, Germany and Japan to acquire nuclear weapons, they would rebalance global military capabilities in favour of a coalition of states committed to the rules-based system and to stopping the erosion of its key norms, especially territorial integrity. Selective proliferation would thus revitalise the increasingly brittle post-1945 order that has so benefited the United States and its allies, which is just an out-and-out admission that this rules-based order is for a select, exclusive group.
Because the actual post-war order, Elisa, was the United Nations and the UN Charter, in which every country has sovereign equality, right? And every country gets to talk to each other. What they're talking about is this rules-based order where the Americans say we rule the world, which really came in after 1989, actually, not after World War II.
And despite this reinvention of history, they, in this article, are calling Russia and China the revisionists, and they really push the Japan front, saying that, you know, the local proliferation of weapons, if Japan took this up, would assist with the, quote, containment of China through strong local alliances.
So like I said, when Japan has started saying this, China's reaction is based on not just that it's Japan doing it, knowing that America is in the background, or people in America are in the background putting Japan up to this. Japan is going to be its proxy, America's proxy, for a conflict with China, just like they've used Ukraine as their proxy for a conflict with Russia. And if China's going to react to Japan saying, oh, we might send our Japan Self-Defense Force to Taiwan to get involved in a conflict over there, if they're going to react the way they have over that, how's China going to react if suddenly Japan has nuclear missiles in it? If Japan is given nuclear weapons, how's China going to react to that? Right? This is the people. There are some people in America that are so insane. They not everybody wants to rule the world. These guys want to blow up the world. And I put people like Mike Pompeo in that category, who in 2023, when he announced he was going to run for president, he never ended up doing it. He said he would get Taiwan to declare independence, knowing that would trigger World War III there. And this is what comes out of the United States. This is insane.
Now, given that picture, which you've just heard about, why on earth is there complete radio silence about this from the Australian government?
Well, that's a good question, especially when what makes it worse, Elisa, is that what would Israel be saying publicly if suddenly actual Nazis took power again in Germany, right, and said they're going to get involved in wars again?
And America then said, let's give them nukes.
And we'll back them up. Because, funnily enough, while Holocaust denial and everything like that is completely illegal in Germany, right, their counterparts on the other side of the world, in Japan, have got away with for a long time a growing current. Like I said, there's a big current of trend of genuine pacifism in Japan, but there's a disturbing trend, and it's a growing trend of right-wing revisionism, where they deny they want to militarise and they deny what they did in World War II. One of those was Shinzo Abe himself. Shinzo Abe is also the grandson of one of the war criminals of World War II, I believe in either Manchuria or Korea. It might have been Korea in his case. We'll put a picture up on the screen where he's posing in a Japanese Self-Defense Force jet a few years ago, and see the number 731. That was deliberate. 731 was the name of the unit that the Japanese had in Manchuria that was conducting biological experiments on live Chinese prisoners. They just made a movie about it in China. I attended the premiere called 731 Evil Unbound. He was doing that sort of thing. There's a shrine in Japan. I wrote it down here somewhere. Yasukuni Shrine. It's the shrine to honour Japan's military heroes. It includes the war criminals from World War II there. Abe is one of the regular visitors to that shrine, as is his current Prime Minister, Takaichi, a regular visitor to that shrine. These are, by doing this, Japan officially apologised for what it did in World War II. Right? There was some big time in the mid-90s it apologised, etc. And so people are saying at China's reaction now, yeah, but Japan, you're overreacting. No, whatever government in 1995 might have apologised, right? But this is a growing trend that's starting to take over Japan at the very time it's remilitarising. And we had our own experience of it here. I want to share another picture in a second. until 2023, for a few years, Japan's ambassador to Australia, his name was Shinzo Yamagami. We've written about this in previous issues of the Alert. He was an actual agitator in the Scott Morrison years against. He was here to try and destroy the Australia-China relationship. He was getting out there attacking. He was being very undiplomatic, getting out there attacking the Chinese as often as he could, etc. And he became good buddies with Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton and Maurice Payne and whatever. Yet this guy himself is an open denialist of Japan's atrocities in World War II. And we wrote an article, if we can put the picture on the screen, where at the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, a BBC journalist did a piece about the end of World War II 80 years ago, and she used the word atrocities, and you can see his tweet about her attacking her use of the word atrocities. Well, what else do you call it? As I pointed out in my speech, Elisa, to the premiere of the film 731, we have a seat in Parliament called Bullwinkle. It's named after one of Australia's most famous survivors of a Japanese atrocity, when a bunch of nurses in Indonesia were raped by Japanese soldiers and then forced to walk into the sea, and they mowed them down with machine guns. There was one survivor, Vivian Bullwinkle. She went on to be the head of the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital for decades. Very famous woman. There's a seat named after her in Parliament. You can't pretend these things didn't happen. And we had a fraction of what the Chinese suffered, right, in places like Nanjing, etc. This guy's in Australia being best buds of our politicians. And look at the photo of the day he actually got it got too much for our government. Eventually Penny Wong made it clear, hang on, this guy's out of control. So the Japanese recalled him. The last night here, he had a dinner at the embassy, a farewell dinner. Look who turned up. Peter Dutton, Scott Morrison, you can see Maurice Payne, Simon Birmingham, their wives, etc. They're all out of politics now. I'm very interested in the guy on the right. That's Greg Moriarty. He is still the serving Secretary of the Department of Defence in Australia. It just blows my mind. If Israel's Secretary of its Department of Defence was friends with Germany's most vocal Holocaust denier, that would raise questions. Our Secretary of the Department of Defence is friends with a notorious atrocities denier from the only country that ever threatened us. And he's attending his farewell dinner. And he's still the Secretary of Defence now. Right? Why are we like this? Only one reason. We are subservient to the United States agenda, which has unleashed this. That's why we're like this. That's why we need an independent foreign policy, and we've got to become a sovereign country.
Because look, you could say, what could we really do? Well, if we were to vocally object, that may help to calm things down significantly, because the thing is, we would not be alone in that objection. And in fact, just at the same time that this Council on Foreign Relations article came out, the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation was meeting in Moscow, 17 to 18 November, and they were discussing how to actually revive the post-World War II order that was constructed on the notions enshrined in the United Nations Charter of the sovereignty and equality of nation states, and constructing today a multipolar order. So we would emphatically not be alone, and this is the reason not to despair, that you have the majority of the world, dubbed the Global South, that is actually pushing forward to get real change here. Of course, that is what the Anglo-American alliance sees as a threat.
And right now, like what you just raised a good point. If we actually objected, so we don't have to become friends. I'm not advocating enmity with Japan. I always say I'm glad we're friends with Japan, despite what happened. But if we can be friends with Japan, we sure as hell should be able to be friends with the country who was our ally, China, who's never threatened us. But because we've been silent on this insult, our silence is an insult to our war dead.
Yes.
Right? Because we've been silent on it, and it's only China that's reacting, then that China gets to be pigeonholed, right? That's big bad China overreacting. No, if Australia also said, well, hang on, we were victims too, right? This is not acceptable to us. You know what you do? You strengthen the hand of the people in Japan who genuinely want peace and don't like what's happening. They have a stronger position because they can cite Australia's disapproval. You strengthen the hand of the people in the United States who don't want to literally blow up the world like some of these crazies do, right? Oh, the Australians aren't happy. They've expressed it, right? You show respect to China, right? We actually respect that its 35 million war dead and wounded were people who deserve respect as well, right? And you actually can take the heat out of it. That's what a country like Australia could do. And in fact, there's an interesting parallel. In 2004, when we were genuinely trying to be friends with China because we're doing all these iron ore deals and that. Alexander Downer, who's a total US sycophant otherwise, was in China. George Bush started saber rattling over Taiwan. Alexander Downer was asked, what would Australia do if there was a war over Taiwan? His instant answer was, well, America should not rely on Australia if it starts a war over Taiwan. And as soon as he said that, which was controversial in some quarters at the time, but he did it with John Howard's approval. I mean, these two are the biggest US butt lickers we ever had, but they were able to say that 20 years ago. George Bush stopped saber rattling, right? Because it's like, well, if Aussies aren't going to... The Aussies, they just follow us blindly on everything. What, they're not going to follow us on this one? We better back off. We can play that kind of role. But what we're doing with our subservience to this American agenda, we end up doing the opposite. We help to fuel the fire.
Yep.
And like I said, it's an insult to our war dead.
That's right. So join us to fight for a sovereign foreign policy. There's so many other areas where it must be applied.
Yeah, one thing quickly, the breaking news today, which we're going to talk more about, is there's now an AUKUS oversight committee in Parliament. We haven't got an AUKUS inquiry, but there's an oversight committee. So they're going to be about 6 members of that committee. We're going to make their lives miserable. We're going to be bombarding them non-stop with the fact that the Australian people don't want this stupid deal that's going to further undermine our sovereignty.
That's the show for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for tuning in, and see you again next week.